Hello, my name is Nicholas Morton, and in this talk I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the situation in Syria and Egypt on the eve of the First Crusade. Within this, I'm going to be focusing on Fatimid Egypt and also the Seljuks of Syria, but it has to be said that there were many other powers in the region as well. These include various Bedouin tribes, leading Arab dynasties such as the Banu Munkids, the rulers of the town of Shaizar, or the Banu Uqail, the rulers of the town of Kalat Jaba. There's also various Armenian leaders in the north and other Turkish dynasties as well. But we're going to be focusing on the Seljuks and Fatimids, who represent some of the more powerful territories in the region at this time. So let's start with the Fatimids in Egypt. The Fatimid Empire began as a Shia Islamic religious movement in North Africa to the west of Egypt, but then in the mid-10th century it conquered Egypt, which became the centre of its power. The empire's leader was the Caliph, although by the time of the late 11th century the Caliph was more the nominal ruler and most executive authority was held instead by the Vizier or chief minister. Now, at this time, the Fatimid Empire consisted of Egypt itself, but also parts of the Syrian coastline, particularly the major ports, including places like Tyre or Acre. The Fatimids also had a degree of authority over various other Muslim dynasties further west along the North African coast. Now, a key factor for understanding the Fatimid Empire at this time is that it is extremely wealthy. Now, that wealth comes from a number of sources. Firstly, there's the Nile Delta itself, which floods every year as the Nile floods, and that then irrigates the soil, enabling the Nile Delta to produce enormous crops, which is good for the food supply, but also that creates revenue for the rulers who can tax all those goods. Egypt is also a crucial waypoint for various trade routes crisscrossing the region. These include gold being brought up from sub-Saharan Africa, spices and precious stones brought across the Indian Ocean from India but also from Southeast Asia, other goods arriving via the Silk Roads from Central Asia and also from China, and also other traders from the Mediterranean basin, whether that's the Byzantine Empire or Western Christendom. And of course all these goods can be taxed, which brings substantial revenue into the Fatimid dynasty. Now, much of that money was then spent on the army, and the Fatimid army was one of the largest and best equipped forces of this period. It's thought to have numbered somewhere between maybe 10 to 15,000 troops, but it had a very distinctive character because the Fatimid Empire's army was put together from various different groups who each contributed different types of troops. And so there are infantry forces from Sudan. In some periods there were Berber forces from North Africa who operated as light cavalry, Turkish light cavalry archers, some Armenian archers, to name but a few. And so the Fatimid army was put together from these various different contingents. Now, this is important in part for the history of the Crusades, because this is the army the Crusaders would meet in battle. But it's also important for the period directly before the First Crusade in the mid-11th century. And the reason for this is that for many years in the mid-11th century, the Nile didn't rise. And this caused famine, and it also substantially shrank the revenues of the Fatimid Caliphate. Now, this was a problem because if the Fatimid Empire can't pay its troops, if it can't maintain its position financially, then it has a very serious problem. And so in those central years of the 11th century, the Fatimid Empire became consumed by a civil war as different army groups fought amongst themselves, trying to gain predominance. Now, by the time of the First Crusade, that has to some degree passed. The situation is a fair bit more stable, but nonetheless that period of disturbance does sit fairly recently in the Fatimids' history. By the late 11th century, The Fatimids' main enemy by this stage is the Seljuk Turks in Syria, and the Seljuks invaded in 1077 and almost conquered the Nile Delta, but eventually they were defeated and forced to return to Syria. But for much of the late 11th century, Syria, and in particular the region around Jerusalem, in fact, is very much on the front line between the Seljuk Turks to the north and the Fatimids in Egypt. And again, this is important context for understanding the situation both in the late 11th century but also in the 12th as well. Otherwise, the Fatimid Empire faces very few threats either to the west or to the south, and so its orientation is very much to the northeast, looking towards the Levant and to Syria. Another important factor is the Fatimids' maritime power. The Fatimids have a substantial fleet, which indeed will become an issue for the Franks or Crusaders when they arrive at the end of the 11th century. They've also got a substantial mercantile marine, and so their traders are known to operate across much of the eastern and central Mediterranean. Okay, so I hope this has given you a brief introduction to the Fatimids and you found it useful. We're now going to move on to the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks first entered the Syrian region in the 1070s, so only a few decades before the Crusaders. But the background to their arrival goes back several decades before that, to the turn of the first millennium. Now, at that time, a confederation of Turkish groups in Central Asia began to move south. Now, we're not quite sure why this happened, but what we do know is that these groups staged a series of invasions that saw the conquest of much of Persia, that's modern-day Iran, and then after that, what today would be modern-day Iraq and Syria, and into the Caucasus, and also into Anatolia, that's modern-day Turkey, to establish what would become known as the Seljuk Sultanate. Now, originally the Seljuks were just one family among many, leading these wars of conquest, but in time they acquired prominence, taking the title of Sultan. And a key moment in this process was the conquest of Baghdad in 1055. Now, the Seljuks expanded on many fronts. One particularly well-known area is in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, which at this time was the eastern part of the Byzantine Empire. And the Turks staged various raids and incursions into the Byzantine Empire, perhaps most famously winning the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, following which various Turkish groups continued to take land from the Byzantine Empire as it fell into civil war and internal conflict. But as for Syria, in Syria there were various wars of conquest fought during the 1070s and 1080s, and it was during this period that the key cities of Aleppo and Damascus fell under their various rulers, and for much of this period there's an ongoing conflict with the Fatimid Empire in Egypt and along the coastal regions of the Levant. Now, during this time period, the Turks were slowly adopting Islam as their main religion. Originally, they followed the steppe beliefs of their ancestors, and the process of converting from their former beliefs to Islam was sort of part way through by the time of the First Crusade. Now, adopting an Islamic identity and Islamic beliefs would have helped the Seljuk Turks in terms of ruling the Muslim populations of the Near East. There are also many groups who are prepared to resist Turkish authority as well, and it's notable that when the Crusaders arrived, many groups rose in rebellion against the Turks, so they need to be understood as a ruling group, but with many other communities under their control, many of whom are not reconciled to Seljuk overlordship. And so already there are various lines of conflict when it comes to the Seljuks in Syria. They've got the populations under their control, their war with the Fatimids, but there's another dimension to their various conflicts as well. And that is that in 1092, the current Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah was murdered. And this then precipitated a civil war that would last for many, many years and would embroil warriors from across the Seljuk Empire. Now, within this, one of the major protagonists in the various civil conflicts over who should become the next sultan was Tutush, who is the brother of the murdered Sultan Malik Shah, and his area of authority was Syria, so particularly the cities of Aleppo and Damascus and surrounding regions. And so Tutush moved east to join the civil war and to stake his claim, but he was killed in the fighting in 1095. Now, here we're only 2 years ahead of the arrival of the First Crusade. Now, Tutush's lands, and particularly his key cities of Aleppo and Damascus, were then inherited by his sons, Ridwan, who took the city of Aleppo, and Dukak, who took the city of Damascus. But here's the crucial point, and that is that these two sons soon became engulfed in a conflict amongst themselves, trying to gain the upper hand over one another. And that conflict was raging even as the Crusaders were advancing across Anatolia from the north. An important feature of this conflict is that Ridwan, the ruler of Aleppo, actually reached out for Fatimid support, even though the Fatimids were the traditional enemies of the Seljuks, in the hope of securing allies against Dukak, although in fact that alliance was fairly short-lived. And so my basic point here is you can see the Seljuk Turks are in a very embattled state on the eve of the First Crusade, and that conflict takes a number of different forms. So that brings me to the end of my introduction to the Fatimid Empire and the Seljuk Sultanate on the eve of the First Crusade. I do hope that you found it useful.